We turn this morning to an 18th century figure, and I want to speak to you on the life of John Newton, who was born in 1725 and died at the age of 83 in 1807. There are two reasons why I choose Newton's life particularly. Firstly, because it has its own fascinating interest. His personal history was charged with drama, and it is both moving and instructive. A modern secular writer has said of Newton's life that it enshrines one of the most fantastic fairy tales that was ever the true story of a human being. Now, in the second place, and more important, Newton became one of the most outstanding writers on practical experimental Christianity. William Jay, who was a famous minister in Bath, said that John Newton was the most truly Christian man that he ever knew. And Newton's gift to the church was not the same kind of gift as the Puritans and Reformers and others had. It was not his calling primarily to give mental knowledge and instruction so much as it was his gift to apply the truth in a practical, experimental way. To give you one of his sayings, which is characteristic of his emphasis, he says, "A scholar may know the name of a maid's broom in 20 different languages, but a maid may know how to use that broom better than any scholar." And so with a Christian, it is not how much we know, but how we use that knowledge and what we are as a result of the truth that we know. And this was John Newton's great contribution, and will ever remain so through his writings and through his letters. Now, he was born, as I say, in July 1725, on the 24th day of that month. His mother was a sweet, pious Christian. His father was a seafaring captain in the Mediterranean trade. So he scarcely knew his father. At any rate, his father was always to him a distant and reserved and rather awesome figure. But his mother was the one who watched over his early life, who taught him when he was 4 years old Isaac Watts's hymns, who taught him the Shorter Catechism, and more than anything else, taught him in the Scriptures. So that before he was 7 years old, there were considerable portions of these Scriptures and Catechism and hymns that he had committed to memory. She was a dissenter, attending one of the nonconformist London churches. But then when her son, John, their only son, was only 6 years of age, coming up for 7, she was taken seriously ill with consumption, and an old school friend offered to nurse her in her home at Chatham in Kent, between Maidstone and Rochester. So, on account of the severity of his mother's illness, neighbours took the young child, John, and his mother was taken to this home in Chatham. But there, instead of recovering, she died before Newton was 7 years of age. There followed for him a lonely and difficult childhood. His father was generally away. His father married again. There were other children born, but Newton was never really in the centre of a family life. He went to school, a boarding school at Stratford, and then at the age of 10, he left school and joined his father on board ship. So from the age of 10 to 16, John Newton sailed the high seas with his father. And he tells us that those years were years of great struggle for him. He had imprinted upon his memory the truths that his mother had taught him, and yet he was surrounded by the worldliness of an 18th century ship. It's true that he was often under his father's eye. He lived in his father's cabin. But he also says that when he was out of his father's sight, he joined often in cursing and in forgetfulness of God. I often saw, he says, a necessity of religion as a means of escaping hell, but I loved sin and was unwilling to forsake it. Then he tells us, when he was in his mid-teens, of a day when the ship that they were on stopped it's on the German coast at the time at Middelburg, and Newton on his own wandered through the town, quaint old medieval city, and there he bought something which radically affected the next years of his life. It was a book. And if anyone ever speaks of the evil influence of a bad book, it's John Newton. The book was Shaftesbury's Characteristics. Shaftesbury was an 18th century deist, a free thinker, as they were then called. They believed that there was a creator, and that the creator had set the universe in being, rather like an inventor would set a machine in motion, and thereafter the course of events and of the world was to be governed by man. There was no heaven and there was no hell. Morality consisted of very few items, and it was more or less extraordinarily similar to the humanism of today, in a somewhat different dress. But Newton says that that book worked on his mind like a slow poison, and gradually there was destroyed within him the conviction of truth. Shaftesbury was a very clever writer, and he wrote beautiful prose, and he wasn't so much a downright atheist as a man who suggested that it was the mark of a brave man to be prepared to doubt, that the man who had to know everything for a certainty was a man of a small mind, but a truly thinking man, and a man who was prepared to face the world was a man who was ready to encounter doubts, and he insinuated doubts, and he did it through his books with many people. Such was the afternoon outing which Newton had in Middelburg. Now, by the time he became 17 years of age, his father was despairing of him. He was showing no aptitude as a seaman. He had become introspective and moody. He would sit on the deck and brood and be absorbed with his imaginations. His father thought he was indolent and unprepared for work. So his father made an arrangement that he would go to a new career on a plantation in Jamaica. Although he was 17, there was great need for Englishmen, and he was offered, through a friend of his father's, quite a good post in Jamaica. Of course, Newton was only being directed by his father, but this was arranged. He was to sail from Liverpool in the month of December in 1742. There was a coach from London to Warrington once a week, and it was arranged that he would catch the coach of the next week to Warrington. Then he would complete his journey on foot. And then something happened. The people who had entertained his mother when she was dying were a family called the Catletts, and they lived, as I told you, in Chatham. John Newton had never met them, but he had heard of them, and he had a week to fill before he caught his coach to Warrington. His father sent him on a message to Maidstone, and Newton, remembering the Catletts lived in Chatham, asked permission to visit them, and so he did. And this was a great turning point. In the Catlett home was a young lady by the name of Mary, nicknamed Polly. She was 13 years old, and from the moment that Newton saw her, he fell desperately in love with her. He said, "I was impressed with an affection for her which never abated or lost its influence a single moment in my heart from that hour." Now, although Newton seemed somewhat indolent to observers, he was in fact very determined and also impetuous and quite inventive. So he did not tell the Catletts that he was due to catch the Warrington coach, and the days glided by until he was quite sure that it was too late to catch that coach from London. But then he consoled himself that the ship wasn't sailing for another fortnight to Jamaica. He could wait another week and risk his father's wrath. But having waited the second week, he decided Jamaica was impossible. 4 or 5 years away from Mary, the thing was unthinkable. So he actually stayed in Chatham for 3 weeks until he was sure the ship had gone, and then he faced his father's wrath. His father forgave him, although he was extremely angry with him, and packed him off again to sea. So he had a year in the Mediterranean, in Venice, and other places, and then back to England. And then he more or less repeated the same thing. This was a year later, December 1743, visited Chatham. I won't say he overstayed his time, because apparently he was very welcome in the home. The mother of the family had been a great friend of John Newton's mother, but his father again was intensely angry with him. That brings us up to February 1744. Newton was just waiting for another ship, and as he was sauntering along the waterfront one day, he was press-ganged into the Navy. Now in that year, 1744, war broke out with France, and as most of you probably well know, the Navy had at that time power to impress any able-bodied men that they cared to, so that you would get these gangs of men under an officer, and when they saw anyone who looked like a seaman or was wearing dress which suggested he had been at sea, they would seize him and take him on board ship. And this is what happened to Newton. In a flash of an eye, he was taken by these men, put on board a tender called the Betsy, and then taken out to sea to a man of war, the Harwich. Well, Newton had been a sailor, as we've been saying these many years, but he'd never been on board a naval vessel, and they were a rather different proposition. For one thing, they were very much larger. The average merchant ship of those days would have a crew of perhaps 25 or 30 men, whereas a ship, a man of war of the size of the Harwich, was over 900 tons, and it had a crew of 350 men. And the lowest of the crew, who were in what they call the cockpit before the mast, they were crowded in like animals. And often men were put on board naval vessels as an alternative to being hung if they were criminals. And all kinds of the riffraff of society were crowded into the decks of these ships. And it was indeed a tremendous transition for Newton. He wrote at once a note to his father, thinking that his father could use his influence to obtain his release, but his father could do no such thing. The most that his father could do was to get him prompt promotion. So he was elevated from the cockpit to the rank of a midshipman, and took his place in the gun room on the Harwich. Well, that was a considerable rise in his fortune, but it was still a great shock. And the shock was increased when he learned soon after that the Harwich was bound for the East Indies, and it might be away for 4 or 5 years. Newton took the risk, went on shore one day, borrowed a horse, rode to Chatham, paid his last farewell to Mary Catlett, and back to the ship. I don't know, it's not recorded what exactly happened on the visit, but her parents by this time were evidently thoroughly alarmed at the ardour of Newton's affection, considering, I suppose, the youth still of their daughter, and the meeting terminated apparently with Mary Catlett's parents informing him that he was not to visit there again, at any rate not until he had his father's permission to marry. So he went back to the Harwich. The Harwich sailed down through the English Channel to the East Indies. But by the time she was passing the coast of Devon, there were certain repairs evidently needed, and unexpectedly she pulled into Plymouth. And here Newton was overcome once more with his impetuosity. The captain had certain things that he wanted collecting from the shore, so he put so many sailors in a longboat, and because many of them were men who had been impressed, he was determined that none should desert, so he put Newton in charge of them as a midshipman. Well, you have anticipated correctly what happened. John Newton actually deserted this man of war. No sooner was the boat in Plymouth than he found the road to Dartmouth and began to walk. His father was in Dartmouth at the time on another ship, and Newton evidently was persuaded that if he could reach his father would be able to do something to secure his transfer from the Navy. But alas, he never got to Dartmouth. He had walked about a day and a night, and he was met by a party of soldiers on the road. They recognized him easily enough as a sailor and probably a deserter. He was taken back to Plymouth. And they brought me back to Plymouth, he says, and I walked through the streets guarded like a felon. My heart was full of indignation, shame, and fear. He had good reason to be afraid. Naval discipline in those days was particularly brutal. He was imprisoned, first in Plymouth, then he was taken back on board the ship in chains. The next day, the whole ship's company, 350 men, were assembled on the decks. The ship's carpenter was appointed to put up the gratings, as they were called, and upon these gratings men were tied before they were flogged with a cat of nine tails. A man might be given 100 lashes, and each new bosun would give a dozen, one bosun would give a dozen, and then another, and we don't know how many Newton had, but he was fearfully flogged, stripped of all his rank, and then with his wounds thrown back down into the cockpit before the mast. He tells us he was full of despair and rebellion. And as the English coast disappeared at last out of sight, he was tempted to throw himself into the deep and die. And he says there were only two things that prevented him in his own thoughts. One was thinking of what Mary Catlett would feel on hearing such news, and the second was his rage against the captain. Though I had well deserved all I met with, and the captain might have been justified if he had carried his resentment still further, yet my pride at that time suggested I had been grossly injured, and this so far wrought upon my wicked heart that I actually formed designs against his life, and this was one reason that made me willing to prolong my own. Well, he was exposed now to all the insults of the crew. His former friends on the upper decks ignored him completely, and he was the object of general contempt and ridicule. He says at this time he had abandoned all faith in the Scriptures. On the Harwich, I met with companions who completed the ruin of my principles. His conscience was silenced, and Scripture, which he had learned as a child, he says he now began to use as a subject for jokes. The Harwich pulled in at Madeira. It was quite early in the morning, and Newton was still in his hammock when one of the midshipmen came down and saw him in his hammock, told him to get up at once. He was slow in getting up, and this man cut it down, the cord down, with his sword, so that Newton landed on the deck. He went up aloft, and as soon as he got there, he saw that there was a little rowing boat alongside, and one of the men from the Harwich was being put down into the boat, and two men were being brought up. Now, this was something that often happened. A naval boat could stop another merchantman, and it could demand two seamen, perhaps that were more able-bodied, or perhaps which had gifts in carpentry or gunnery or something. And that is what had happened. It had requisitioned two seamen from another boat, and then, of course, the naval vessel gave two of its own crew who were less competent, and this man was being put into the ship, into the rowing boat. Newton at once pleaded that he might also be put off the ship, and it was granted. There was about, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour between the time that he was sleeping in his hammock and the time that with his few belongings he was in a boat bound to the other ship. He had only one book, he says, with him. That was a book of Euclid and geometry, a few other possessions, and that was all. Now, the new ship was a trading vessel to the west coast of Africa, to the Guinea coast, or the Slave coast as it was often called. There was at that time from London and Bristol and Liverpool tremendous trade with Africa, and mainly in slaves. There were about 8,000 English seamen employed on the slave route. Boats went down to Guinea, then crossed the Middle Passage over to the West Indies or Carolina, took across their slaves, then they brought back to America cotton and other produce. And it was said of those 8,000 seamen that perhaps as many as 1,500 died every year as a result of the climate and the rigors of what they were exposed to. But of course that was very little compared to the figure of the deaths among the slaves. There was perhaps an annual trade in slaves of something like 15,000 men. No, I'm sorry, that figure is wrong. Let me give it to you correctly. John Newton said, writing later, if the English ships purchased 60,000 slaves annually upon the whole extent of the coast, the African coast, the annual loss of lives of slaves cannot be much less than 15,000 a year. He tells us of one ship upon which there was no epidemic. It sailed across from Africa to Carolina. It had 218 slaves on board, and of that figure 62 died. And when an epidemic came, it was often far higher. Now there were some good captains of these vessels, and some who maintained strict discipline. There were others who were obviously indifferent and cruel. Newton tells the story of one ship in which a young woman, a young mother, was taken as a slave with a child just a year old. The child was crying and obviously terrified, and it was dealt with by throwing it into the sea. And Newton said they would have thrown her in two, except that she was too valuable. So there were appalling horrors, and these horrors were practically unknown in England. It was once men crossed the equator and reached these foreign parts that some of them became more like brutes. And it wasn't until 40 years later that the slave trade became a matter of common knowledge, and then action was taken. Well, Newton arrived then on the Guinea coast, and by this time his character had degenerated to almost its lowest point. He became a little lower, but he couldn't have gone much lower. The admonitions of conscience, the warnings of conscience, which from successive repulses had grown weaker and weaker, at length, he says, entirely ceased. And for a space of many months, if not for some years, I cannot recollect that I had a single check of conscience. At times I have been visited with sickness, and have believed myself near to death, but I had not the least concern about the consequences. Now on this small ship with some 25 men, Newton made himself a considerable difficulty with the captain. John Newton had a great facility for rhyme and verse, as we shall later know. But at this stage, he used it for quite different purposes. He composed a song about the captain of the ship, and it was so clever and humorous that the whole ship's crew was singing it in a short time. And that was not the kind of thing which happened on board ships in the 18th century. The captain died suddenly on the west coast of Africa, and the mate was put in command, and this mate could see at once that he and John Newton could not be on the same ship. Or at any rate, Newton was desperately afraid that if a naval vessel drew near, the mate would immediately make sure he was put on board it. So when they came to the coast, Newton asked leave to join an English trader, which they were carrying back as a passenger. This trader said he would be responsible for Newton, and Newton then landed on the coast of Africa. And there he was to stay for 2 years. In later life, Newton said that he believed that one reason why God allowed him to land on the coast of Africa was that in isolation he would be less peril to other people. Because by this time, he says, he not only sinned with a high hand myself, but made it my study to tempt and seduce others upon every occasion. He was not given to much drink, and he retained the virtue of honesty. But apart from those two things, he was a man who broke the law of God at apparently almost every point. He became then the assistant of this English trader who was a slave collector. He went up the rivers, made journeys inland. The further inland you went, the cheaper the slaves became. So this man had a kind of depot on the coast, and then he made his journeys and often took Newton with him. But after Newton had been there just a little while, he took seriously ill of one of these fevers that was so common. And the trader left him at the depot while he went inland. The person in charge of the depot was the trader's mistress, a black woman who lived with him as though she were his wife. And as soon as the trader was gone, she turned all her hatred upon Newton. For some reason she disliked him bitterly. Then Newton's illness grew worse. She saw that he had no comforts. He slept on a mat with a bit of wood for a pillow. The only food he got was by coming to her plate at the end of meals and taking whatever scraps she cared to leave. And on one occasion he says that she handed the scraps of her plate to him, and he was so desperately weak he was unable to hold the plate, and the contents were spilled amongst the dirt on the floor to her great merriment. And at night he would crawl out of his little covering to wash his shirt. He had only one shirt. He washed it and let it dry on his back. He would scrape around, digging up roots like raw potatoes to eat. And in this way he was indeed a prodigal, reduced to the very depths. The trader returned. Newton complained of his treatment, and the trader did not heed it. In fact, Newton became himself a kind of white slave. When he went on a journey with this man, if the man left him, he would chain him to the deck without food. He would just have a bit of a fishing rod, and he would live perhaps for a day or 2 days or more on simply the fish which he could catch out of the sea. After this had gone on for about a year, another English trader arrived, and the man who was treating Newton so badly was no doubt alarmed at Newton's condition and allowed him to go into the service of this other man. And this was considerably better. Newton's great hope was that he could make a lot of money quickly, and with that money he could go back and marry Catlett. Suddenly one day a ship arrived at the shore where they were, and it was a ship belonging to Joseph Manasty, who was a merchant of Liverpool and a friend of Newton's father. And the captain had been instructed to find Newton. And by this providence, for it was a remarkable providence on that great coastline, the ship had pulled in at the spot where Newton was. Newton now was very doubtful about returning. He had no money. He didn't know what he would face on arriving home. But the captain of the ship, by a succession of lies, told Newton that relatives had died and left him money and so on. Newton was enticed back on board the ship and taken back to England. Not at first to England. The ship, the Greyhound, was recrossed the Atlantic. It had a cargo of wood and beeswax. And then from America it recrossed to England. And then in March 1748 a great event occurred. On the night of the 20th of March, Newton went to bed as usual, and in the early morning of the 21st he awoke to a tremendous noise and to find that the cabin was awash with water. A shout had gone up that the ship was sinking, and he and his companion in this cabin rushed to the deck. Newton was first up the ladder, but just as he was going through the hatch, the captain shouted to him to go back and bring a knife. So he turned round, his companion rushed on before him and was immediately swept right over the side and drowned. Newton came back up, and there followed a tremendous battle to keep this ship afloat. For 9 hours Newton worked on the pumps. For 11 hours he stood roped to the helm. And if it had not been for the fact that the ship was carrying a cargo of wood and beeswax, it would certainly have gone to the bottom. The side was ripped open, the waters flooded the deck, and yet amazingly it kept afloat. When this storm was still at its height in the early hours of the morning, John Newton said to his companion who was with him on the pumps, he said, "This will give us something to talk about over a glass of wine in a few days." But his companion replied with tears, "No," he said, "it is too late now." At 9 o'clock in the morning, when the storm was still at its height, Newton was speaking to the captain of what they had done, and he added, "If this will not do, the Lord have mercy upon us." And it was the first expression, he says, of any desire for mercy, uttered, he says, unconsciously, the first expression for many years. And as he went back to the helm of the ship, the words that he had spoken so, as it were, without thought, came with power to his conscience. What mercy can there be for me? I expected that every time the vessel descended into the sea, she would rise no more. Well, the ship survived. And on that 21st day of March, 1748, John Newton's great deliverance came. When he stood at the helm of that boat as it went up and down into the ocean, he says, "I now began to think of that Jesus whom I had so often derided. I remembered the particulars of his life and death, a death for sins not his own. But I remembered for the sake of those who in their distress should put their trust in him. And now," he says, "I chiefly wanted evidence. The comfortless principles of unbelief were deeply riveted." And he says he rather wished than believed that the gospel record was a fact. And then, speaking of a few days later, "One of the first helps I received was in reading the New Testament from Luke chapter 11. I was conscious that to profess faith in Jesus Christ, when in reality I did not believe his history, was no better than a mockery of the heart-searching God. But here I found a Spirit spoken of who was to be given to those who ask it. Upon this I reasoned in this way. If this book is true, the promise in this passage must be true. I have need of that very Spirit by which the whole was written, in order to understand it aright. God has promised here to give that Spirit to those that ask. I must therefore pray, and if this book is of God, he will make good his own word." If what I am writing should be read by our modern infidels, they would say, for I too well know their manner of argument, that I was very desirous to persuade myself into this opinion. I confess I was. And so would they be, if the Lord would show them, as he was pleased to show me at that time, the absolute necessity of some expedient to stand between a righteous God and a sinful soul. Upon the gospel scheme, I saw at least a peradventure of hope. But on every other side, I was surrounded with black, unfathomable despair. He wrote his testimony in many of his later hymns. "In evil long I took delight, unawed by sin or shame, till a new object met my sight and stopped my wild career. I saw one hanging on a tree in agonies of blood. He seemed to charge me with his death, though not a word he spoke. Or again, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," and so on. And this day, the 21st of March, was a day which Newton remembered until his death. In his age 83, he never forgot this day. Well, after great difficulties, the ship arrived in Ireland. It was a battered wreck. Came into Londonderry. He worshipped in church the next Lord's Day. A week or so later, he was in Liverpool. And now, of course, the hope of Mary Catlett was everything in his eyes. He had not heard from her for 4 years. And so he had no idea what to expect. But he had one encouragement. His father had just sailed for Canada. But before his father left, he had heard of Newton's return to Ireland. It had come to him as a great surprise. Like a voice from the dead, he thought Newton had died long ago. And out of affection for his son, he had gone to the Catlett's home in Chatham, and he had given his permission for marriage. So that difficulty was over. But Newton's greatest difficulty now was in getting his marriage proposition conveyed to Mary Catlett. The trouble was that when he thought about what he would say to her, and even when he made notes about it, he was very eloquent. But when he actually met her, he was completely tongue-tied. He says he went down to Chatham, but having got there, he left without accomplishing what he had set out to do. So as soon as he got back to Liverpool, he determined that he would do it by a letter, and this is what he wrote. I soon set off for London to see you. That's Mary. See you I did, but little more. I was tongue-tied as formerly. When I had just feasted my eyes, I returned to Liverpool at almost as great an uncertainty as before. I cannot say quite, for I saw so much generosity in your behavior as encouraged me to hope on, and I ventured afterwards to put it to a final issue to yourself by letter. When I received your answer, I kept it some time before I dare open it. When I did, I was transported to find you kind. For though you wrote in the most cautious terms, I knew it was much in my favor that you would write at all, and that you designed, I should understand it to be so. Well, Newton was aged 23, and he had really lived the life of most people. At the age of 23, he was offered the captaincy of his own vessel. Becoming wise, he declined it. He went back to the West Coast on a voyage as mate, returned in 1750, married Mary Catlett, and then went to sea as captain himself. In 1751 then, to 1754, he was a Christian slave captain. You may wonder how that was possible, and perhaps we shall have opportunity to return to it. But here he was as a young Christian, with no other Christians on board. Indeed, Newton at this time had scarcely met an evangelical Christian. He went to a church in Charlestown in Carolina, where the gospel was preached, but he was so uninstructed in the scriptures, he said he couldn't even understand the sermon. But he gradually grew in knowledge. And on his last voyage, his third voyage, as captain, he met a Scotsman by the name of Cluny, who was another captain. And this man was an earnest Christian. They would meet in their cabin and pray together. Cluny would exhort Newton to make an open profession, to begin to witness to the men of his ship. And this man, Cluny, had a great influence on Newton. And Cluny began to tell Newton what was happening in the churches. Newton had no idea. Cluny told him of a man by the name of George Whitefield, who God had raised up to revive the church. He heard of others, such as the Wesleys, and of what was happening in different parts of the world. And as a result, when Newton came back to London in 1754, he began to attend upon the ministry of George Whitefield. There are accounts in Newton of his visits to the tabernacle which are enthralling. How he met Whitefield for the first time, how he wept under the preaching of the gospel, how at 5 o'clock in the morning he would hurry to the tabernacle for those early morning sermons, sit with those dense throngs of people under the gospel. Oh, it was heaven on earth for John Newton in London in those days. Just as he was to return on his fourth voyage, he collapsed, and the doctors strongly advised against him going back to sea. So instead he went to Liverpool. And at Liverpool he was there for 8 years as the tides master, kind of role of watching the River Mersey and taking some customs responsibilities, a general role that he was fitted for as a seaman. And there he remained, as I say, for 8 years. He found Liverpool spiritually a very dark place. There was a small Wesleyan witness. There was no Reformed church. He begged Whitefield to come and preach in Liverpool, and Whitefield, I think, did on one occasion. But spiritually, it was very needy. John Newton joined the Baptists. He was not a Baptist, but he found his spiritual warmth amongst the Baptists. And then came the day when he made a journey with his wife, Polly, Mary, to Yorkshire. And in Yorkshire, he came across the great revival. William Grimshaw at Howard and Henry Venn at Huddersfield. And this, to Newton, was like as he had seen in London, but in Yorkshire, at that time, hundreds upon hundreds were entering into the kingdom of God. Now, Newton was busily studying the Scriptures, but for some time he was convinced that he was not called to the ministry. But now the thought began to increase within his conscience that it may be that that was his calling. It began by his concern for the lost around him. We read in his diary of the prayer that he offered to God for Liverpool, for Lancashire, how increasingly they developed in his soul a love for people. This led in the year 1764 to his becoming the curate of Olney in Buckinghamshire. Now I'm cutting the story short. He applied to many bishops for ordination. First of all to the Archbishop of York. In every case they refused him. Then he wrote in longhand an account of his conversion, his authentic narrative. And it came into the hands of Lord Dartmouth, who was an evangelical nobleman. Dartmouth was very struck with it, and he was the patron of Olney Church. And as a result of Dartmouth's intervention, Newton became the curate of Olney in Buckinghamshire. And so John Newton, from the year 1764 to his death in 1807, was a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I will conclude now this part of Newton's life with one or two lessons drawn from it. Let us first remind ourselves of the utter wretchedness and power of sin as exemplified in his life, and how sin gains its power from unbelief and from infidelity. I gradually, he says, deviated from the principles in which I was educated till I became profligate and abandoned. The way of transgressors will always be hard. He speaks of being poisoned with infidelity. Then he says, bad became worse. I forsook God, and he left me for a time to follow the way of my own heart. And he says how afflictions did not change him. When he was starved and ill on the coast of Africa, he said he was like a tiger, emaciated for want of food. But if food had been given him, he would have become, as he did, as wild as ever. We learn from this record the power and grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. I can see no reason why the Lord singled me out for mercy but this, that it seemed good to him. His reason, unless it was his reason to show by one astonishing instance that with him nothing is impossible. I stood in need of an almighty Saviour, and such a one I found described in the New Testament. He says on that March day in 1748, Christ met with him, and I have reason to praise him for that storm, for the apprehension I had, first of sinking under the weight of all my sins into the ocean, and then into eternity. All the evil that I suffered was the immediate result of my own folly and willfulness, but the good I have experienced was wholly unmerited and for a long time unhoped for. How sweet the name of Jesus sounds, he wrote, in a believer's ear, soothes his sorrows, heals his wounds, and drives away his fear. Amen. As you would observe yesterday morning, I was not able to complete what I had hoped to say on John Newton, so I continue this morning. And I feel guilty in not having orderly layout of my material, but I am consoled by one fact, and that is that John Newton had this particular failure. He was very much an extempore preacher, that is to say, although he meditated upon his subject, if he had any fault, and no doubt it was quite a serious fault, he did not lay out his material in an orderly manner. Well, I shall be following in his steps in that regard. I have reflected on what he would have thought of such a gathering here this week. And there are two thoughts which immediately come to my mind. He would have been immensely delighted. One of his greatest pleasures was to spend a great deal of time with young people. As one reads through his life, this is recurring again and again. With children, he was an expert in making paper boats and Chinese junks. He used to get little boys on his knees and bounce them up and down to a naval song, and then he would tell them a sea yarn. And then when children got older, he would spend much time with them, speaking to them on spiritual things, and particularly encouraging young men in the work of the Christian ministry, so that there is no question at all that he would have been delighted to have been at such gatherings as we have been having this week. And then what would he have thought about our speaking about him? Well, there are some things that he would certainly have thought about it, and I will give you one quotation. He was fond himself of reading biographies, and one of the biographies of which he was fond was the life of Philip Henry, the Puritan pastor, the father of the famous Matthew Henry. But he had this to say about Philip Henry's life. If the lives of the two Henrys and of other good men were written by inspired men, you would not be so much discouraged at reading them. Depend upon it, they saw as much reason to be ashamed of themselves as we do. To us they appear in their best clothes, and we are told more of what the Lord wrought for them than of the effects of indwelling sin under which they groaned. So he is saying that the difference between biographies in church history and the biographies of Scripture is that in the biographies of Christian men in history, we tend to get the external side of their life and not the indwelling burden of sin about which they were so conscious. And then he's writing to a ministerial friend. He says, if I should outlive you, and I should have a call to write the life of the Reverend Mr. Simmons of Bedford, that's the man, I should perhaps find more to say in your favour than you are aware of. And if you have the darker side known as well as the brighter, and if you would have the darker side known as well as the brighter, then you must write it yourself. And one of the helpful things about John Newton's life is that we find from his letters and from his diary, which is quoted in various books which I shall mention later, we find that the man gives us a very realistic view of what he was himself. Listen to him at the age of 30. Too often, he says, my mind is little better than the wayside, a highway for carnal, evil thoughts of every kind. And then he says of a Sunday that he had just spent a dull, barren day, this proved to me. Crowds of vain thoughts within me prevented my hearing with any profit. Then listen to him as an old man. I find, he says, I find not one corruption of my vile heart is dead. though some seem now and then to sleep. And then this last reflection on himself, which he wrote in his old age. It's in the form of a comment on Paul's verse, "By the grace of God I am what I am." First he says, "I am not what I ought to be." Ah, how imperfect and deficient. Second, "I am not what I might be, considering my privileges and opportunities." 3, "I am not what I wish to be. God, who knows my heart, knows I wish to be like him." 4, "I am not what I hope to be, ere long to drop this clay tabernacle, to be like him and to see him as he is." 5th, "I am not what I once was, a child of sin and slave of the devil. Though not all these, not what I ought to be, not what I might be, not what I wish or hope to be, not what I once was, I think I can truly say with the apostle, by the grace of God, I am what I am." So that he would have cautioned us, you see, from taking from his life certain things which might even prove a discouragement to ourselves. When he was advanced in life and quite a famous man, he said, "When I am tempted to think I am somebody, I mix a little plantain sauce with my diet, and then I know what I am." That will not mean anything to you until I remind you that the name of the part of Africa where he settled when he was in that wretchedness for 2 years was called the Plantains. A little plantain sauce was the memory of that time of his utter wretchedness and bondage. And when he remembered that, he says, he knew what the grace of God was to him. Well, then we shall continue on our course with John Newton. And I had arrived at the point when I had said that he became curate of Olney in Buckinghamshire in the year 1764. And somebody asked me since how it was that a seafaring captain could, without going to any universities, rather suddenly become the clergyman of a parish church. That, of course, is partly to do with the utter confusion of the church position in the 18th century. You noticed I said that Newton was curate of Olney. The vicar of Olney lived miles away and never even came near the parish. Newton was never more than a curate. And through the system of patronage which operated by great men and patrons and so on, livings were bought and sold and pluralities were held. A man might be vicar or rector of several parishes at once. The position was in general confusion. Nevertheless, the bishops certainly stumbled at the extraordinary idea of a seaman like Newton becoming a minister of the gospel, and particularly because he was branded as a Methodist. The Methodists were the followers of Whitefield and Wesley, the men who preached the necessity of the rebirth, and that was sufficient stumbling block to the bishops of that time. But Newton had been studying. He studied hard on board his ship when he was captain. He had his Latin books which he worked at. He studied the scriptures. And as one looks at the earlier life of Newton, we are reminded of how God prepares us, each one, for the work which he has for us to do. It was not to be Newton's work to be a great instructor of others in doctrine and theology. If that was to have been his work, God would have prepared him in a different way. But as we noted yesterday, his work was to be a counselor, a practical advisor, a letter writer. That was his great work. And to prepare for that work, he needed much time to meditate and to become a letter writer. And on those years away at sea, he got his practice writing his letters to his wife. And if you can get hold of the works of John Newton, you'll see that many, many pages are taken up with his published letters to his wife. These were published after her death. Not all were published. but many of them. And you see, from the earliest days then of his Christian experience, he was being led and prepared for the particular work in which he was to be of the greatest usefulness. So by the study of Scripture and by reading of other things, he was mentally, to a considerable extent, prepared for the ministry. And some indeed said that he was above the average graduate of Oxford and Cambridge. Well, it was through the intervention of Lord Dartmouth that he was given the curacy of Olney. Let me just tell you one story which Newton told, which illustrates in a rather humorous way, I hope I can remember it, how in those days one could arrive at a position by not going through the normal processes to arrive at it. This man was a carpenter of which Newton speaks, and in the course of his work as a young man, he had certain employment in the Inns of Court in London and in the Temple. He had to lay floorboards and do various things. And in the course of his carpentry work, he noticed these unusual books in the library on the work of law and so on. He began to study them. And so diligent was he in his studies along with his carpentry that before very long, Newton says, he became a barrister himself. And then, believe it or not, he actually became a High Court judge. Well, this was not viewed with favour by all members of the legal profession, and on one occasion, when this man had ascended to the judge's bench, he reproved a lawyer for the way in which he had presented his case. I think he was the counsel for the defence, and the judge told him that he had not made his case plain. He says, "You've not even made it smooth." And this lawyer, resenting the comment, rose and said he could not help that matter, for he was not bred as a carpenter. And the judge, without losing any composure, replied at once, "That is quite evident," he said, "for had you been bred as a carpenter, you would have been a carpenter still." Well, that story illustrates that men did move about in rather strange ways in the 18th century, and also it gives you a little of John Newton's humour. And lest I forget to tell you, that certainly was a characteristic of the man. As we've often been reminded and commented on even this week, a conversion does not change a man's temperament. John Newton was by temperament a rather cheerful extrovert, and as a Christian he remained so. It was his vow to be a cheerful Christian, and God gave him much grace to do that. But besides being a cheerful Christian, he had this considerable extent of humour. He was once with a group of young people. As an old man, he was sitting in his chair, I think with his seaman's jacket on. He never wore the proper clerical dress, and in his old age he became rather stout and bald, and as they were talking, he gave a tremendous sneeze, and there was a fly on his head at the time, and the fly flew off. And John Newton said, "If that fly keeps a diary, he'll say, 'Today there was a tremendous earthquake.'" So there are many things like that in Newton, and you can see why young people enjoyed him, because he was full of this kind of thing. So then he went to Olney in 1764. I'll come back to that. Olney is a little town in Buckinghamshire. If you went there today, you would hardly find a soul walking on the main street. It's a very quiet backwater. But in those days it was a busy town. It was on the main coach route. There were many public houses. It had quite a considerable population. It was a lace-making town. There were over 1,000 lace makers in Olney. There was a great deal of poverty. Lace making was not a profitable industry in the 1760s, and John Newton found that he had come to a parish which socially and above all spiritually had great problems. There had evidently been little gospel preaching there for many long years. says how the children ran wild about the streets. One of the early funerals that he had to take, the children accompanied the coffin to the grave as though it was some kind of pantomime. Tells us of the bell ringers in the town that used to get drunk, and one night when they were drunk ringing the bells, one of the bells fell down and killed one of these drunken bell ringers. There were many things like this which indicated the necessity of a gospel ministry in Olney. And Newton gave himself wholly to that work. Before long the church was crowded. In a little while they had to build an extra gallery, or rather a gallery because there was not one there before, and the church ultimately could hold perhaps 1,500 people. So he gave his early years at Olney solely, or almost entirely, to the work of the parish and the building up of the few believers which there were in Olney. And the work was, of course, far too much for him. And in 1767, God sent him a great friend, and these two men worked together in Olney for 12 years. And the friend was William Cowper, written William Cowper, C-O-W-P-E-R, but pronounced in those days Cooper. And I must pause for a few moments to tell you who Cowper was. He was 7 years younger than John Newton. He was born in 1731. Educated at Westminster School in London, entered the Temple to prepare for a legal profession, and until about the age of 30 had idled away about 10 or 11 years in legal studies without really accomplishing anything. Then in 1763, a relative of Cowper's offered him the clerkship of the House of Lords. This man had the office in his patronage, and he offered it to Cowper. Well, Cowper by temperament was highly nervous and prone to melancholy. No doubt it was a hereditary thing that had run his family. His mother had died when he was only 6 years of age, like Newton. He had an unhappy childhood, and he was a very sensitive, introspective young man. And while he desperately needed a good job, the fact was that this post of clerkship of the House of Lords necessitated some kind of brief public examination at the bar of the House. And the prospect of such a public trial completely unnerved him. And by the end of 1763, Cowper had had a serious mental breakdown, indeed so serious that he had tried to kill himself, and by the end of the year 1763, he was completely insane. He was taken then to a mental asylum at St. Albans under the care of a Dr. Nathaniel Cotton. And it was there in the summer of the following year, 1764, that sitting beside a window, picking up a New Testament, he tells us that his eyes fell on those verses in the 3rd chapter of the Epistle to the Romans, whom God had set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood. And the doctrine of the imputed righteousness of Christ as the ground of our peace broke in upon his soul, and he was filled with peace and with wonder. The hymn that we sang the other night was Cowper's hymn, of course. There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins. Sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. And that was his experience in the summer of 1764. He then had a problem what to do with his life, because he was utterly wearied of London. And he felt that he would rather die than sin, and that the country would be a far better place for him spiritually. He had a brother in Cambridge who was a Cambridge Don, a clergyman, and also a Don in St. Benet's College. So he decided that he would take up lodgings in Huntingdon, which is a small town, as you probably know, not many miles from Cambridge. So Cowper went to Huntingdon, went into lodgings, And within a few months he was finding himself excessively lonely. He still had the joy of his salvation, but he was beginning to become anxious, because the truth was he knew no one in Huntingdon, and while Cambridge was not so far away, he could not be visiting his brother 7 days in the week. And then one Sunday morning after service, he met a young man in the churchyard by the name of William Unwin. And this young man had spotted him and noticed he was obviously on his own, and next Sunday asked him to come home with him to dinner. And this is what Cowper did. And he not only came for dinner, but he came to stay. Within a few days he packed up all his belongings and went to live with them. And the family that he had come to live with, the Unwins, were an interesting family. The father was a clergyman who had a living in, I think it was Norfolk, but he did not reside there. The mother, her name was Mary Unwin, considerably younger than the father. And then there were the two children. One was William, who Cowper had met in the churchyard. William was 20 years old. And then there was a daughter, Susanna, 18. Well, Cowper lived with them for perhaps 3 years, until 1767. And it was, you might say, a monastic life. They had prayers in the morning and worship. They did their gardening. Cowper had a little money invested, or which had come to him through the family. He had no real need to work. It was a very peaceful and indeed a happy existence, with walks in the afternoon and tea on the lawn. And so it seemed as though it would go on forever. Until one Sunday morning, the father of the family, Morley Unwin, arriving to take a service, was thrown from his horse. His skull was fractured, and he died very soon afterwards. And at once the Unwins were, as it were, left adrift in their spiritual connections. Mary Unwin, in particular, the mother, was a very spiritually minded woman, and their first concern was to find a parish where they could be fed. Well, it was just at this time that Newton had heard of Unwin's death, and although it was some miles away from Olney, he had called to extend his sympathy. And there he was on the doorstep. They'd never set eyes on him before, short-statured, with his cheerful face. They welcomed him in, and within a matter of days it was decided that the Unwins and Cowper would settle at Olney. So to Olney they went in the August of 1767. And William Cowper became the assistant to John Newton. They organized prayer meetings together. They visited the poor. They gave out food and clothes to those who were impoverished, and there were many such. In the afternoons they went their walks together. And then in 1769 they began writing hymns together, the Olney Hymns. Now the purpose of the Olney Hymns was perhaps primarily to convey instruction. Newton was thinking of various ways to reach the young people, particularly of Olney, many of whom did not come to church at all. And he hit upon this expedient. Lord Dartmouth had a house in Olney which he never lived in, and was more or less empty most of the year. So Newton had permission to use one of the large rooms in this house. It was called the Great House. And here he had a weekly prayer meeting and a weekly meeting for young people, which was, they were incorporated in the prayer meeting, I think. One grew out of the other. And for these meetings, they arranged that they would write a hymn. And Cowper wrote one of the first. And the first meeting they had in the Great House, they had Cowper's hymn, Jesus, where'er thy people meet, there they behold thy mercy seat. One of his best known hymns. And so the development of the Olney hymns was almost accidental. It was certainly never intended to provide hymns for the Christian church of all ages, as it has since tended to do. There were about 300 Olney hymns written. We have been singing several of them this week. Approach my soul, the mercy seat, John Newton's Come my soul, thy suit prepare, Jesus loves to answer prayer, another of Newton's Glorious things of thee are spoken. And then Cowper's perhaps are even more beautiful, some of them certainly in their poetic rendering. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform, is one of Cowper's. And so is the other, Cowper's testimony, Hark my soul, it is the Lord, 'tis thy Saviour, hear his word. Jesus speaks and speaks to thee, say, poor sinner, lovest thou me? Well, these and many, many others they wrote together for this little meeting in the great house. It was not until many years later that the hymns were published in 1779, and when they were published, it was first agreed that 1,000 copies would be printed. Then the figure was increased to 2,000, but those hymns have been printed by the million, of course, since that date, and upon that fact, John Newton would have been altogether astonished. If you want to know my favourite of all those hymns, it would be Newton's How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds in a Believer's Ear. Well, this was the origin of the Olney hymns. Their work went on together, Cowper and Newton's, until the year 1773. On the morning of January the 2nd, at the beginning of the year, Newton was woken early and hastened over to the house of his friend Cowper, who had had another seemingly complete nervous breakdown. If you go to Olney today, you can see these two houses, the vicarage where Newton lived, and then behind the vicarage is a garden, and there was an orchard, and the other side of the orchard is the house called Orchard Side, and in Orchard Side, Cowper lived with the Unwins. And they just had a path through from one back garden to the other, and the two houses, you might say, were almost joined. Mary Unwin, the widow, was a very close friend of John Newton's Mary. These two Marys would sit sewing together in the evening while the men would talk or read a book. John Newton liked to read, or rather Cowper liked to read books like Captain Cook's narrative or Anson's Voyages Round the World. And as he did so, Newton would begin to talk about Africa and so on. And then Newton liked to learn more about the classics. And so Cowper, who was a classical scholar of great ability, he would perhaps be reading Homer or something like that and expounding it to Newton. Newton would be puffing at his pipe. And this had gone on. This had gone on happily for some while. And then Cowper had this further breakdown. And I don't intend to stop to talk very much on that. In the next issue of the Banner of Truth magazine in September, if you see that magazine, I have an extensive article there on Cowper's nervous breakdown and his affliction. The fact of the matter was, in a few words, that Cowper had this constitutional tendency, and it reasserted itself even in him as a Christian. And until the end of his life, he had great struggles with despair. Sometimes the heavens were utterly black. He felt that God had cast him off forever. At other times, hope was stirred within his heart. But it is a sad story. And the truth is that Cowper never recovered the extent of spiritual joy that he had in those 7 years after his conversion. The latter part of his life was spiritually a great struggle. But he became a man of great usefulness. Everybody knows, or ought to know, of William Cowper the poet. John Gilpin was a citizen. And then he goes on about John Gilpin's Ride, you remember, how the horse ran away and so on. Well, that was one of his better known poems. But he wrote many poems, The Task, and I can't give them to you. They're not much read these days. But we must remember that in the 18th century, there was a great fashion for poetry. And Cowper was raised up as a Christian poet, and people by the thousand read his poems. And in these poems, he inculcated Christian truth, spoke on the Sabbath, on the law of God. He condemned faithless ministers, and these poems had a tremendous influence upon the state of England. And they resulted, really, from his nervous breakdown, because when he recovered, he found he needed some relaxation. And his relaxation was partly carpentry and partly gardening, but then partly poetry. Because of his spiritual depression, he could not write any more hymns. He didn't feel that he was able to. He didn't have enough assurance himself. But he wrote these wider poems, and certainly under the hand of God, they had a great influence. Now I must say a few words about that romance which you were so interested in yesterday with his wife Mary. Where are my notes on this? They married, as I told you, in the year 1750, and they were given 40 years of happiness together. On the 25th anniversary of their wedding, John Newton wrote, "This is the 25th anniversary, that great hinge, our marriage, upon which all the leading events of my life were to turn. We are still preserved to each other, forward with health, peace, and with abundance of earthly blessings. Oh, for more thankful hearts." Then he says, "My love was grown pretty tall when I married you, and it has been growing ever since. It was once an acorn, but it has now spread branches and a deep root like an old oak." And then, later on, he writes to her when she was absent, "No time in your absence passes so pleasantly as when I am thinking of you, writing to you or hearing from you." I mean this with proper limitation. Dear as you are to my heart, you were not, you could not be crucified for me. Nor do I live and move and have my being in you, but in Jesus. May he be our supreme Lord, our chief beloved, and may his grace teach us to love each other in him, and then we shall not exceed. And that is connected with the verse that we sung in that earlier hymn, "One there is above all others, well deserves the name of friend. His is love beyond a brother's, costly, free, and knows no end." As I've read Newton, there is only one point at which he had a real disagreement with his wife, and I must give it to you because it illustrates a very important side of John Newton's character. He was a man of truly Catholic spirit. That is to say, where he saw the image of the Lord Jesus, and where he believed that men love the gospel, then he made his business to stand with them and to hold such fellowship with them as he could. Now, after he had been in Olney a little while, the Baptist brethren began to grow in numbers. And they even had the temerity to hold a meeting on the same night as they met in the great house for their prayer meeting. And Mrs. Newton was very upset at this, no doubt feeling that her husband's position was in some ways reflected upon. And we read, therefore, in one of her personal letters when she was away from home, she wrote to John Newton. He had evidently been telling her what he had been doing, and he had been at one of the Baptist meetings and having fellowship with these brethren. And she wrote back, "I do not care about your going to hear the Baptists." though I am very glad you did not dine with them. Now this is what he writes back. He says, I hope you will not be angry with me for daily praying to the Lord to deliver you from a spirit with respect to the Baptists, which I am sure is not pleasing to him, and which I am persuaded hurts you. It likewise has often grieved me. And then he says, we must try to bear with each other upon this point, till the Lord gives us to be of one mind about it. And when he does, I think the change will be in you. This is quite a nice squabble that goes on for a few pages, and obviously there was more to it. But in reality, it was a very, under the hand of God, it was a matter of great seriousness, because Newton developed friendships in the Midlands, and the men who became his close friends amongst the Baptists were men who were to be used to the establishing of the gospel in that great continent in the Far East. John Ryland, Jr. of Northampton, Baptist pastor there, the son of the quaint old John Ryland, William Carey, who was baptized by Ryland, and others. These were the men who were much younger than Newton, but who gained so much from him. And had Newton followed his wife's counsel, these men would have been deprived of one of the great influences upon their early life. Let me just give you a quote which is typical of Newton's pastoral counselling. He's writing to one of these Baptist ministers, John Ryland. And John Ryland was the opposite to Newton in his temperament. He was always prone to see the dark side of something and to worry excessively about things. And Newton was the opposite. He was quite easygoing and sometimes almost too cheerful. Well, Newton writes to him, the ship was safe when Christ was in her, though he was really asleep. At present I can tell you good news, though you know it. He is wide awake, and his eyes are in every place. You and I, if we could be pounded together, might perhaps make two tolerable ones. You are too anxious, and I am too easy in some respects. Indeed, I cannot be too easy when I have a right thought that all is safe in his hands. But if your anxiety makes you pray, and my composure makes me careless, you have certainly the best of it. What Mr. Martin was bringing to us the other evening on the necessity of making friendship with unconverted people is very much illustrated in Newton. When he got to Olney, he found that amongst the neighbouring clergy there was perhaps no one who was really preaching the gospel. And while he did not in any sense open his pulpit or his spiritual ministry to friendships with these men, he did seek to befriend them as individuals. He felt they were in utter ignorance. There was a nearby clergyman, not long after he had gone to Olney, who was drunk one night, and in his drunken stupor he had set fire to curtains and burnt himself to death. And evangelicals were shocked and horrified that a clergyman should die in such a condition. But Newton felt nothing but profound compassion. He said that he had been in such a condition often, and yet God had not taken him away in his sins, and he went out of his way to befriend men. And one man who he befriended was a clergyman by the name of Thomas Scott. Now Scott was quite a scholar and loved an argument, and he knew that Newton was an evangelical Methodist, and time hung heavily on his hands, so he entered into a correspondence with Newton. And you must read that correspondence for yourself. It was printed later in a book in which Scott gave his testimony to how he was converted. From being a rationalist, he became an evangelical Christian. Let me just mention this. Scott was very prejudiced against Newton until one evening he had a report from one of his parishioners about one of his members who was very ill. And Scott perhaps had seen this person once or twice, but that night he heard that John Newton had come all the way from Olney to visit this person. Newton knew that nobody would be dealing with them about their souls. Now Scott was moved by that fact, that this man sincerely was seeking people's spiritual good. That helped him to listen to Newton. Well, Scott was then converted. But what happened after his conversion? Well, he also began to preach the gospel. And one of the young men who came often to hear him preach was William Carey. William Carey was born in Paulus Pury in the Midlands, was a nonconformist, was a Baptist, as you know, but not having much teaching, he came to hear Scott, and many years later in India, Carey said how much he owed to the ministry of this man. It all began because Newton befriended him. It's an illustration, a very striking one, I think, of what we were considering the other evening. Well, Newton remained at Olney until the year 1780, and then he moved to London. His last years at Olney were rather difficult and sad, partly because of Cooper's illness, partly because there was a spiritual decline in the church, which he couldn't rightly account for. The services were not so well attended. There seemed to be less spirit of prayer. I think that is something which has been true in the ministry of many famous ministers. People become accustomed to a gift of God. They know the man so well that they cease perhaps to regard him as they ought, as a messenger of God. And it may well be too that Newton had a weakness in regard to his strong points. You know, our strong points can very easily be our weakest points. In this way, John Newton's gift was of great gentleness and tenderness. He felt so deeply his own wretchedness as a sinner that he was very, very tender in dealing with others. But his gentleness sometimes seems to have been, well, almost a softness. There was the old woman who said to him when she was very ill, she said, you often spoke to me of Christ, but you never warned me of my danger plainly enough. And that does seem to represent a certain weakness in Newton. And then, as I mentioned at the outset, he had this habit of extempore preaching. There is just one point, and it's the only one I know, in which a minister should not follow John Newton, and it was this. He had a struggle to know how to preach. For the first time he preached in Yorkshire, going back now many years, he preached without any notes at all. And he got to his first point in the sermon, a few minutes on the first point, the second point, and his mind was a complete blank. And he sat down in great confusion. The second time he preached, he had a complete manuscript, and he followed each line. And he said he dare not lift his eyes from the line, because he would never find it again. And then he was depressed for days. And he came to the conclusion that the only way he could preach would be out of a warm heart. So he threw away all his notes, and he meditated on his subject. And while that is good for occasional preaching and for itinerant preaching perhaps, when one is preaching for 12, 16 years to the same people, you can easily see what happens when a minister does that. He goes over and over the same ground. And I think that probably happened in Newton's case. Well, he was called to London. I am about, he said, writing to a friend, to make a connection with one Mary Woolnoth, which I hope will be for life. And Mary Woolnoth was the name of the parish church, St. Mary Woolnoth, in the city of London. His coming to London at that time was, under the hand of God, the means of strengthening and bringing forward the whole evangelical witness. One of the men that came to hear John Newton preach was William Wilberforce, great parliamentary leader as he was to become. Wilberforce was converted if I remember rightly, by the reading of Philip Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. But it wasn't until he talked with Newton and others that he was given that boldness and resolution which came to mark his life. As a leader in Parliament, he gave himself to every cause which furthered the kingdom of God. He went up himself to Liverpool. He looked into the slave trade. He infuriated the merchants. You may have read how on one occasion, as Wilberforce was standing by the dock and the water beside him in Liverpool, there was an attempt to push him over into the sea. Wilberforce became a great Christian leader. And he did what Cowper had done in another way. He spoke to the higher society, not by poetry, but by a book. He wrote a book, title's evading me, A Practical View of Christianity, was that it? Something like that. A very famous book. And one of the people whose conversion was connected with that book was none other than Thomas Chalmers, who was converted in Scotland about the year 1810, became the leader of the Evangelicals in the Church of Scotland. So Wilberforce was one of the men who was so influenced by John Newton. Now, our time is really gone, and there are certainly one or two things which I had wanted to give to you. I certainly must give you his last words before his death. I have told you that he lived to be a very old man, 83 years of age. His wife died about 13 years before him. As he was awaiting his death, he said, "I am like a person going a journey in a stagecoach, who expects its arrival every hour and is frequently looking out at the window for it." And then with his old touch of humour he said, when somebody asked him how he was, "I am packed and sealed and waiting for the post." William J. visited him near the close. He was hardly able to speak. He, however, said to William J., "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things, that I am a great sinner and that Christ is a great Saviour." And when he was turned 80, his friends were really concerned about his preaching, because with memory almost gone, he would stand in the pulpit desperately short-sighted. He couldn't have even seen notes if he'd wanted to then. And he had a servant who stood behind him who would try to prompt him where he got completely, as it were, astray in his drift. And one of his best younger friends, Richard Cecil, pleaded with him to lay aside this particular aspect of his ministry. There was no need for him to continue to preach. And Newton, in indignation, said, "What?" He said, "What? Shall the old African blasphemer stop while he can speak? Shall he stop while he can speak?" There's one point upon which I find Newton especially helpful, and upon this point I will close. It's on the connection between faith and our feelings, our enjoyment, our conscious pleasure in communion with Christ, the joy of the Christian life. Now, as a young Christian, John Newton had that overflowing joy. But as he went on, he learned that God had other things to teach him. This is what he says in one place. "Through divine grace, I have been led to live above and beyond my frames," that is, my emotional states, "to live upon the everlasting righteousness of my dear Redeemer, to which my best obedience can add no value, and from which all my infirmities can take nothing away. So these things," that is, his inward problems, "though they take from my pleasure, have no considerable effect upon my peace." And that's an important distinction. Our peace and our pleasure are not the same. Then he says in another letter, He said, when I was writing from this desk yesterday, I had a beautiful prospect of the Isle of Wight. I am looking today through the same window, and I can see nothing. But I do not suppose the Isle of Wight is sunk, because I cannot see it. I consider that this is a thick, rainy morning, and I expect when the weather clears up, the island will be visible again. Thus it is, he says, with respect to many great truths, which you and I have seen with the eye of our minds. There may be returns of dark, misty hours, when we can hardly perceive them. But these should not put us on questioning whether we ever saw them at all. Faith, he says, faith and obedience are like the road we travel. The frames and feelings of our spirits are like the weather. Though the weather may often change, the road, faith and obedience, is always safe. And they who travel upon it will renew their strength as they go on, and at length surely arrive at the end of their journey and possess the promised land. Well, if you read this little paperback of Newton's letters of John Newton, you will find a great deal of that practical wisdom. Just a word on the books on Newton. The best biography is by Josiah Bull, written 100 years ago, Josiah Bull. There is a modern biography by Bernard Martin, which gives you a little more facts, but spiritually is not nearly so helpful as Josiah Bull. Then there are those books on Newton which are semi-fictitious. You may have read some of them. These are the historically more valuable ones. His works were printed in 6 volumes. And then there was a 1-volume edition. And the 1-volume edition is more valuable in one respect. Its print is much smaller, of course, but it has the authentic narrative in, which the 6-volume edition doesn't have. And I think that if you search second-hand bookshops for John Newton's works, you should find them without very great difficulty, because so many editions were printed. We'll stop at that point.